Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Anita Black. I am your instructor professor for this course. This week, we're moving into Module 5, which our topic are perpetrators of child sexual abuse. So let's look. There are uniform characteristics of these perpetrators, two of which really stand out. Perpetrators generally put themselves in positions that provide easy access to children or adolescents, and they exploit the power or authority of those positions in order to sexually coerce their victims. And a lot of times this happens over a lengthy period. There are nonetheless characteristics of perpetrators that are assuredly unique. Effectively posing as a police officer, while also claiming to be a medically trained practitioner capable of performing physical examinations on them. These are a couple examples. Perpetrators, as I said, choose their victims very carefully. They will look for vulnerable children, such as those who are passive or quiet, and they often use their authoritative power to prey on the trust of both children and their families. There's a portion in your book that talks about if these perpetrators are sexually motivated. The prevalence of child sexual abuse is difficult to determine because it's often not reported. Experts agree that the incidence is far greater than what is reported to authorities. When I was working with child sex offenders, juveniles, I had to go through initial training when I began there, and learned that before these perpetrators are caught, they have committed over 100 acts. So it's very difficult too, as it says, to investigate all of these. Many may be mild, doesn't matter, but they're just not reported. And so child sexual abuse is also not uniformly defined in areas, so the statistics may vary. There are some statistics here that represent some of the research that's done on child sexual abuse. Sexual interest in children, while common, was not the sole motivational factor influencing behavior. Other key factors include gaining of personal affirmation and a desire for power and control. Most sex offenses are not sexually motivated. They're not trying to achieve a sexual desire. It's all about control and power over their victim. The most common life event participants indicated might have had a formative impact on their decision to ultimately sexually exploit children involved in sexual experiences in childhood. In other words, we should only study the offenders and not the victims. Where I worked at the treatment center, the owners they were actually both working with victims of sexual abuse and realized that helps after the fact, but they wanted to stop abuse altogether. So that's when they changed and started working with the offenders. So what is pedophilia? Who is a pedophile? Pedophilia is defined as the ongoing sexual attraction to pre-pubertal children. That's a hard word for me. In the new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is used by healthcare professionals throughout the United States, pedophilia is categorized as the sexual preference of prepubescent children and a disorder in the case of additional factors. These factors include experiencing significant distress and impairment by fantasies and urges, or it's the acting out on a more of a behavioral level, including child pornography, consumption, and or committing hands-on child sexual abuse offenses. Now, P.E. Dietz, he classifies pedophilia under two main categories, situational and preferential. The pedophilia and child sexual abuse or molestation are often used interchangeably, so it's important to delink these two concepts. The growing use of the terms pedophilia and pedophile have become have come from expanded publicity and awareness that concern the sexual abuse of children, as we may casually refer to someone as neurotic, paranoid, or delusional without necessarily assuming psychiatric expertise or implying a psychiatric diagnosis. It is increasingly common among the lay people to consider someone who has sexually victimized a child as a pedophile, and they label all individuals who molest children as pedophiles. However, this is incorrect. As with any mental health diagnosis, the DSM-5 that I referred to a minute ago, pedophilia is listed in there, and there are certain necessary elements that must be included in order for someone to be classified as a pedophile, just as with any other type of mental illness. I will see if I can locate that DSM-5 and see if I can put those requirements of a pedophile within the unit. So are child sexual offenders psychopaths? Again, this is a diagnosis where certain conditions must be met. According to a 2003 National Institute of Justice report, 3 out of 4 adolescents who have been sexually assaulted were victimized by someone they knew well. Narcissistic personality disorders were significantly more frequent in sexual offenders than in the comparison group. Also, sexual offenders had been sexually abused as children significantly more often than the non-sexual offenders. Their findings in this report indicate that sexual victimization in childhood might be an important risk factor for sexual offending in later life. As we see here, because someone is sexually assaulted as a child does not mean they will become an offender themselves. But I will tell you that 95% of sexual offenders have been victims of sexual assault. I included, I don't know if it's on this slide, but it's later on, one of the reports that I used, and it's the impact of personality disorder and childhood sexual abuse, and I think it's included on the last slide here. So the main characteristic of a narcissistic PD is difficult in interpersonal interactions. So those with narcissistic PD are incapable of loving care for others and exhibit a lack of empathy that results in a failure to develop stable object relations. There's a great book by Adrian Raine called The Anatomy of Violence. And if you are interested any more within this and psychopathology, that's a great book to read. In fact, I will try. I've got a couple inserts that I use in another class, and I'll post those as well in the module. In that book, which is very interesting, talking about the reports, a psychopath doesn't necessarily become violent. Just want to make that clear here. A psychopath is another diagnosis. And within Raine's book, he talks about he was looking at the brains of violent criminals and those that had committed homicide. And he did brain scans. And so he compared that to a normal brain. So he used his own brain scan to compare, and it goes to find out he had some of the same characteristics, some of the same activity in the frontal cortex that the psychopaths do. And so he realized, just looking back at his life, now he was married, had children, he loved them unconditionally, but he just remembers that he laughs in places that are awkward. For instance, when he was a child, and I'm sorry to go off on this, but it's so interesting. When he was a child, he would do things that boys do, throwing baseballs, and he would throw them at abandoned houses and break the windows. And he just always thought it was funny. He never saw anything wrong with it. And he said the same thing in school. There was one of his classmates that fell over on one of his chairs, and he just burst out laughing. And the teacher, of course, reprimanded him, but he just thought it was funny, but he didn't understand why. And part of that is that he just lacked empathy in certain areas. Also, it's rare, but there are reports of a brain tumor that have caused pedophilia. In one instance, a 40-year-old teacher began to exhibit hypersexual behavior, including pedophilic interest. The man, who previously had not engaged in any sexually deviant behavior, began viewing child pornography on the internet. He started soliciting prostitutes. The man's wife reported his sexual advances towards children. Now, he was found guilty of these sex crimes and sentenced to prison. The man recognized that the behavior was problematic, good thing, and wrong, but indicated he did not have the restraint to overcome those feelings. He couldn't stop the feelings. The night before his prison sentence began, he complained of a severe headache and balance problems, along with the urge to rape his landlady. After going to the hospital, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. It was removed and the symptoms disappeared. The man, 7 months later, again reported headaches and began collecting child pornography again. Guess what? The tumor had returned. Now, it was removed again and the symptoms disappeared again. Now, a neurologist commented on the case, wondering if the tumor is the one that caused that behavior because it caused hormonal changes. And this, in turn, caused his abnormal sexual behavior. This next material came from that book right there that's listed, Sex Crimes, from Vandiver and Braithwaite. They examined a broad range of studies, and they found that these revealed 33 to 100% of persons who committed a sex crime had brain abnormalities. For those who had not committed a sex crime, such brain abnormalities were present in 0 to 17% of individuals. Now, other abnormalities have also been identified as potential causal factors of sexually offending, such as hormones, neurotransmitters, brain structure, sex chromosomes, genetic traits, and intelligent deficits. And an example is developmental disabilities. It's widely accepted that hormones or chemical secretions affect a wide range of bodily functions, and this is listed in Stinson et al. 2008. That's included on the last slide. With regard to hormones, testosterone is most closely associated with the sexual arousal of boys and men. It has been speculated that sexual violence is the result of these high levels of testosterone. Now, research has produced mixed results on this. It has been proposed that those who are exposed to high amounts of testosterone or other factors affecting their androgen system, which is a group of hormones that affect the male reproductive system, that affects these while they are in utero, and it's more, when it does this, they are more likely to sexually offend. For example, there is some support was found between prenatal exposure to testosterone and subsequent child sexually offending. And this is from Kruger et al., 2019. The research in this area, however, is scant and relies on relatively small samples. So we have to take this with a grain of salt. And whenever we're looking at research, remember, if I want to do research on a topic, I can probably find what I want to find, but that's not what we do. As good researchers, we look at what's out there and then make results from what we find, not what we want to find. Also, neurotransmitters that are chemicals in the brain, they can affect brain function, mood, autonomic reactions, such as heart rate, breathing, and other bodily functions that respond to certain anxiety-provoking situations. Now, these neurotransmitters, such as serotonin, they have been assessed for their link to violent behavior that include sex crimes. Now, again, there are few studies that have been conducted in this area, and among them, there's very little support for this. So let's look at these characteristics of these sexual perpetrators. In most, but not all, instances, the perpetrators were known to the child and the family. Both younger and older children were abused by a relative, such as mother's boyfriend, mother's ex-boyfriend, biological father, stepfather, uncle, brother, stepbrother, cousin, mother's cousin, son, and acquaintances. For instance, grandmother's boyfriend, a friend, the sister's ex-boyfriend, roommate, classmate, brother's friend, boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, and cousin's boyfriend. So it's somebody comes into some kind of contact with that child. Now, they did find that older children were sexually abused by strangers more often than were younger victims. But again, it's still very rare. To continue, we talk about men as the primary perpetrators, and although the number of female offenders is increasing, is it increasing or is it being reported more? The majority of child sexual abuse perpetrators are males. Generally, male perpetrators are middle-aged and have a low socioeconomic status. Female perpetrators are commonly in their 40s and are often friends of the family. The perpetrators are more aggressive and they cause more serious physical and emotional damage than the male perpetrators. Let me go back. Male perpetrators are more aggressive and cause more serious physical and emotional damage than female perpetrators. One theory regarding male perpetrators of child sexual abuse is that they might be more able to use their physical strength to control and limit the child's victims, limit their resistance, therefore attempting to satisfy their attachment needs and intimacy desires, which fail to be satisfied through normal relationships. That's why they seek out the children. One study by Karlstedt, he reported that male perpetrators with mental health problems such as anxiety and depressive symptoms who manifest aggression and hostility toward women were more likely to abuse younger children. Finkelhor, who is the author of our book, he has a study he completed with his colleagues in 2011, and again, that's on the final slide, reported that female perpetrators were underreported, and it's because of the victim's lack of knowledge that the acts constituted sexual abuse. They may not have realized what they did was actual sexual abuse. Now, regarding male child victims, cultural attitudes about being abused by a female might negatively influence the reporting of that sexual abuse. I'll tell you one example. When I worked with the offenders, we had one client and he sexually abused his infant sister. Now, of course, she didn't report it, but he would do things with her while she was within her bed. And usually, I don't mean to be too graphic, but it involved his fingers. So there wasn't any evidence when you looked at the child. But he was caught, obviously, and ended up speaking about this. But that's another example of even older children that are treated that way by somebody. They might realize they were sexually abused. On the book that we read, and I'm sorry, I can't remember. I was trying to check my notes. It's later on. It's the recording, the book that's the audio book. When you read that, you're going to see too that the little girl, she didn't know that what was happening was sexually offending. They don't know what it is to be sexually offended, so they don't know that it's not wrong. Now, grooming is a huge characteristic of perpetrators, and so because of that, grooming is not going to occur between strangers, because grooming can go through a short period or a long period. So one survey of 182 child sexual abusers found that only 6.5% of victimized children were the ones they did not know. They will become personally and emotionally invested in their victims through a process where the trust and confidence are built through some type of emotional manipulation. Now, this process is called grooming, and it generally involves the skillful manipulation of a child into situations where they can be more readily sexually abused and less likely to disclose the incident, less likely to be found, to be caught. The process of grooming is quite detailed and lengthy and requires patience on the offender's part to maximize the child's trust. Grooming sometimes is well-organized long-term activity. It's carried out in a series of steps that build up to the sexual abuse of a child. These steps include target selection, befriending the target, desensitizing the target, and maintenance. First, talk about target selection. Many people who sexually abuse children have acknowledged that they carefully select their victims by that perceived vulnerability of the victim. Offenders consider many factors in selecting a potential target, including the child's status, like their age, do they have a disability, are they in a divorced or broken family, are they living in poverty. They also acknowledge the child's emotional or psychological state. For instance, are they a needy child? Are they a depressed child or a lonely child? One study, for example, found that people who sexually abuse children often target children from dysfunctional families, those that don't have supervision, and those with some kind of physical sign of neglect. I do want to tell you about an example. When we talk about grooming, is not between strangers. There's a case where, it was on a podcast that I listened to, where a neighbor kidnapped a little girl. She knew him, but they hadn't had really much contact. Well, he kidnaps her and puts her in his closet in a house with other people, and he began grooming her. He began giving her what she wanted to be quiet, explaining to her that I think he was telling her that the family didn't want her anymore, and started to really try to build a relationship with her so that when he did sexually abuse her, she didn't scream out or cry. She just, consented, which that's a legal term. She cannot consent, period. But she would let him do these things because of what he was giving her and what he was saying to her. So I want to talk about the age differences. Now, female perpetrators' preferences differ based on their own age within a relationship to the child's victim age. One study noted that female perpetrators less than 26 years old prefer victims, male or female, who are about 7 years old. Now, the female perpetrators between 30 and 36 years old prefer male victims who are 11 to 13 years old. And finally, they found that older female perpetrators, ones that are older than 36 years old, tend to prefer female child victims and to use force during the assault. So if you look how age progresses and how their level of control and power increases. Talk about juvenile perpetrators. As I said, these are the ones that I worked with. So if you have any questions or want any more information, just let me know. Juveniles under the age of 16 also engage in child sexual abuse. They could be rejected by peers. They have a lack of intimate relationships, and this can contribute to seeking intimacy and autonomy by abusing even younger children or using their authority to satisfy their sexual desires, which is part of the power. Family characteristics could further influence juvenile offenders. In one study of 115 juvenile sex offenders, and their parents, they found that parents of juvenile perpetrators experience social problems such as low adaptation and family cohesion. In a like manner, the juvenile perpetrators displayed poor family and peer bonding. Most perpetrators used grooming again. They use these techniques such as displaying acts of kindness, showering their victims with gifts. They might give them cigarettes, toys, desserts, money, alcohol, or drugs prior to initiating any contact. Others reported that the perpetrators were aggressive, hitting, hurting, or threatening them if they refused to participate in the sexual acts. Also, what juveniles do, this is from my experience, they threaten to tell other people that you did this with me. You wanted this with me. And so what I found interesting working with juvenile offenders, there was a couple of them I worked with that were violent with their victims, but they didn't know it was wrong when they were actually abusing others because they had been abused. They didn't know what they were doing was wrong. They thought it was just normal activity because that's the way they had been treated. And part of the treatment for these offenders was to have that turnaround. We had to change what they considered to be right and wrong within their brain. So they have to understand their risk factors. They have to understand the cycle of abuse. But it was all about just retraining their brain and teaching them that these acts were wrong. Well, that concludes. Let me go to the last slide, where it shows you the references. I think also too, I've added some of these studies that I used. I added them already to the module. So if you have any questions, please post them within the class, within the course, and I'll be more than happy to answer or do any more recordings on this.